Yeah, so this is joint work with James Delgrande. And so here, oops. Okay, there we go. So here in this work, we are basically interested in this overall goal of equipping or basically subjecting artificial agents to social norms and moral guidelines. And more specifically, we want to see how we can basically combine this kind of reasoning about obligation, permission, and prohibition that we have in the field of deontic logics with the popular formalism for reasoning about action and change, which is the situation calculus. And in particular, we are interested in so-called contrary to duty obligations that have some temporal aspect to them. And there is this very famous Chisholm scenario in the deontic logic community, which is slightly rephrased here, but basically it goes like this. So you have a statement saying you ought to go help your neighbor. And then there is another statement saying, yeah, if you are going to help your neighbor, then you should tell them beforehand that you're coming. And if you're not going to help your neighbor, yeah, you shouldn't tell them that you're coming. And then you actually don't go help your neighbor. Yeah, and so perhaps you can see where this is going. So this is basically where the non-monotonicity will come into play. But the thing is that, so the most basic deontic logic is SDL, standard deontic logic, which is nothing more than a KD model logic, where basically the idea is that accessible worlds represents worlds that are ideal, and a formula being obligatory basically then means that it is true in all the accessible ideal worlds, and then we can define permission and prohibition in terms of obligation. The problem with that is that this fails to encode these kinds of contrary to duty scenarios. Yeah, so no matter how you try, and usually you would have to resort to material implications, you will end up either with inconsistencies or with undesired dependencies between the statements. And clearly, intuitively, this should not be the case. Yeah, and it was very soon recognized that this is basically because what you actually need is some sort of dyadic, conditional, defeasible obligation. Yeah, so for example, you ought to tell the neighbors in case that you plan to help them. And then that will give you some sort of order or ranking over worlds, basically ordering them by their degree of ideality, so to speak. And so here we are interested in basically applying similar ideas, but to the actions that we would find in a situation calculus framework. And so here we are not basically using the classical situation calculus, but a modal variant. So essentially, we don't have situation terms, but we have terms of two sorts, actions and objects. And we have fluents, which are predicates and functions that represent changing properties. And to talk about future situations due to actions, we have these two modal operators. Yeah, so basically one taking an action as an argument and basically saying that the formula phi holds after an action A. And box phi basically expressing that phi holds after any sequence of actions. And there is a special semantics that basically defines situations to form a tree structure. Yeah, so where we find basically all sequences of actions, and at every node basically we defined which fluents are true and which are not true. And in addition, we have unique names for objects and actions. And so this is a little bit of a restriction compared to the original situation calculus, but you can basically do all the important things with it that you would do with the classical one. In particular, you can formulate basic action theories in a similar fashion. Yeah, so you would basically represent a dynamic domain by having an initial theory where you state what is true initially, and you would formulate successor state axioms, so write a solution to the frame problem to define the effects of actions. So, for example, a door will be closed if either, so after doing an action A, no matter in which situation we are in, either if that action was closing the door or the door was already closed and the action was not opening the door. Yeah, and so this is basically the modal variant of the situation calculus. And then I had one paper with Gerd Lakemeyer where we basically extended this idea of having these modal operators, and instead of just taking primitive actions, they would now take complex actions or programs. Very similar to what you would find in dynamic logic. So you would have this operator to express that phi holds after some execution of a program delta, where delta may be a non-deterministic program. And in terms of semantics, that would be defined as follows. So you would take your world and your program, and they would form a configuration. And then from this configuration, you would do a number of single action transitions until you end up in a configuration that is a final configuration where basically program execution may terminate, and there your formula should hold. And so programs can consist of these different constructs. So we have an action algebra where we at the very least have like primitive actions, we have tests for formulas, we have sequence, and we have these non-deterministic constructs. And so basically there are rules that define when these single-step transitions are possible and when a configuration involving a certain program is considered final. And these are listed here, so please don't read them all, but just to give you an idea. For example, in case of a primitive action, we can make a transition with that particular primitive action, and that will lead us to basically the progression of the previous world by that particular action. And we get a new program that remains to be executed, and in this case, that happens to be just the empty program nil. And this configuration will never be final. And for example, a test does not admit any transitions, but a test is final if that formula holds in that particular world. And for example, non-deterministic choice is defined recursively in the sense that, you can do a transition in delta 1 or delta 2 if you can do the transition in either one of these programs. And so this is pretty much what we are given, and which is like a very popular formalism for reasoning about action and change. But for this very specific purpose of talking about these contrary to duty obligations, this is not sufficient. But we need, in addition, some sort of notion of joint and negated actions. So, for example, we want to express something like the agent is going to help the neighbor. So that is one behavior expressed by some program. And in addition, at the same time, the agent does not tell them. So we want to basically be able to conjoin these complex actions, these programs, and also negate them. And so often you find in the literature as definition for the joint action that you just treat it as the dual to non-deterministic choice. So very much behaving like conjunction and disjunction. But it's not so straightforward for the case of negation. So at the very least, what we would want is that the negation of a primitive action, of course, does not admit that action, but any other action that is distinct from it. We also should make sure that the negation of a program basically only connects states that are also otherwise reachable through actions. Otherwise, we would get like very funny properties where basically you could do the impossible, right? So if I say I don't eat a pizza, and that would allow me to get from a state A to a state B, where I would basically teleport myself from one place to another or something. Yeah, so something that would actually not be possible. And of course, that's something that we would want to avoid. And in particular, negation becomes tricky when it comes to sequences of actions. Yeah, so in a naive definition, we would perhaps just take the complement of these sequences. But then, for example, we would get that the negation of knocking at the door would still admit the sequence of knocking at the door and then opening the door, which seems kind of undesirable. There is a proposal due to Wansing, who basically defines the negation of a sequence delta 1, delta 2 as the sequence of the negation of these two subprograms, which is kind of technically pleasing, but it's perhaps a little bit too weak and also unintuitive. Then Jim and I had a paper at KEA last year where we basically took the approach to kind of avoid this problem by only applying negation to programs whose duration is exactly one action, so where we don't have any sequences, which is perhaps a little bit too limited. But there's also like very early work due to Meyer, who, among other things, suggests the axiom that if I want to execute the sequence of not, or if I want to execute the program not delta 1 followed by delta 2, this should mean that I either don't execute delta 1, or if I do execute delta 1, then I better follow it up with something that is different from delta 2. Yeah, and so this is basically the view that we want to adopt here. Yeah, and so more specifically, in that particular paper, he proposes 5 axioms for negating complex actions. And so, yeah, the second one is basically the one that we just discussed. And yeah, 3 and 4 are more or less like De Morgan's laws for programs, for actions, which kind of intuitively makes sense. We want to eliminate double negation in the usual fashion. And then the last one is basically concerned with a program that states, yeah, if phi, then delta 1, else delta 2. And the negation should basically correspond to this right-hand side here. And related to that, so if you assume these axioms and the definition of joint action that we saw on the previous slide, then you basically get other properties that kind of explain this intuition behind how we interpret sequences. And so basically, if you conjoin two programs by means of this operator, then you basically require that they kind of that one is a prefix of the other. So if I conjoin delta 1 with delta 1 followed by delta 2, then this is the same as saying delta 1 followed by delta 2. And the special case is that if I have the program that always fails, denoted by bottom, followed by anything that will always be basically equivalent just to a failure. Yeah, and so that's basically the intuition and the idea that we wanted to adopt here. And so in this paper, we propose yet another new logic called ESGL, which is very similar to ESG. But now the semantical models are linear time infinite traces, denoted by tau. Yeah? And so we have these transition and finality rules that we have seen previously, very similar. And in addition, we define now negation basically by having specific rules for the negation of all the different constructs in our action algebra. Yeah, so we have the negation of a primitive action is precisely any action that is distinct, any action n that is distinct from that particular action m that we are negating, and so on and so forth. And again, don't read all these rules. It's just to show you. You will find, of course, the details on the paper. That there is a definition in terms of these rules. So very roughly speaking, for example, the negation of a sequence, here you basically find exactly this idea that we just talked about, that so either you do basically the negation of the first program delta 1 and continue executing the negation of that program, or you do something that corresponds to delta 1, that would be these two following rules, but then afterwards you would have to execute the negation of delta 2. And so on and so forth. And so very roughly speaking, the intuition is that any program delta corresponds exactly to the traces that have a finite prefix that start with a finite execution of that particular program delta. And so in the aforementioned paper due to Meyer, this is basically about his proposal for a propositional dynamic deontic logic, which he calls Pdel, which is based on a very simple yet elegant kind of reduction idea that you represent the prohibition of a program delta by essentially having a special distinguished propositional variable v that intuitively denotes a violation or a bad state. And then you just define a program delta to be prohibited as every execution of that program will lead into that bad state. And then you can define the other deontic modalities in terms of that. And he presents this system, this axiomatic system for Pdel with axioms and inference rules. And so basically, again, don't read the details, but essentially what you see here is that these rules are really only concerned with the semantics of the programs themselves and not the deontic modalities, because these are basically just defined in terms of an abbreviation in terms of this violation constant. And so in the paper we basically show that our logic ESGL subsumes Pdel in the sense that the axioms are valid and the inference rules are sound. And so the basically our semantics follows a similar intuition as the one suggested by Meyer, but the correspondence is not exact, and you will find the details in the paper. And so for handling contrary to duty constraints, and so because we subsume their logic, we can basically we reproduce their approach to contrary to duty constraints in a similar fashion, where very roughly speaking, the idea is that you would have multiple violation atoms and index the modalities accordingly. And so we would represent the Chisholm scenario as saying, O1 help, and it is forbidden according to norm number 2 to not tell and then help, and it is forbidden according to norm number 3 to tell and then not help. And basically this then tells us that if you tell and then help, then you have only one violation, but if you tell and not help, then you have 2 violations, and so the latter would be preferred over the former. This has a number of drawbacks. So basically, you have to state the preference relation explicitly. also it's not very close to the natural language representation. And there's no notion of basically intending to help in the foreseeable future. And so in the aforementioned KR 2020 paper that we had, we proposed another approach where we basically use conditionals over a certain subset of programs called the guarded action fragment, which basically is a fragment that only admits single actions, if any. And we have two types of conditionals saying, yeah, if you're doing delta, then you ought to do gamma afterwards, or a similar one to say you ought to do gamma before. And we presented a semantics that is inspired by rational closure. Yeah, so KLM style conditionals, with the difference, of course, that we're not talking about propositional formulae, but we talk about programs, complex actions. And so instead of possible worlds, we would look at traces, and instead of consistency, we would look at the joint executability of programs. And so we have similar or accordingly defined notions of materialization and exceptionality. And then we would be able to define a ranking very similar to KLM, basically in this inductive fashion, that we would start with basically all rules that we are given, and in the next higher rank we would find the rules that are exceptional with respect to the previous one, and then we can define, or we can assign ranks to traces accordingly. And maybe let me just skip a little bit quicker over this. So we can then represent the Chisholm scenario by corresponding conditionals. And in the end, we actually get a ranking that very much corresponds to the intuition that, yeah, indeed, the most ideal trace would be the one where we first tell that we are coming and then help. And then the next one would be not telling and followed by whatever. And in the worst case, yeah, we tell, but we then actually don't come to help. And then we have another result where we show that we can basically compile this kind of these kinds of rankings into the basic action theory. Yeah, so where we basically only have a basic action theory in the end that we can use, for example, for planning without the need to do this this kinds of non-monotonic computation. And yeah, basically the last contribution of the paper is that so far what we didn't have is we didn't have a notion of intention. So we always assumed that one action immediately follows the other action, so helping immediately follows telling. And this is not realistic because helping the neighbor might require other actions to take place, such as buying supplies. And therefore, in this paper, we propose to use a very simple notion of intention where we apply these temporal operators to programs from the guarded action fragment. Yeah, basically where we're saying within the next k steps, do delta, or always throughout the next k steps, do delta. And so these two are indeed dual to one another. And we can then formulate conditionals over these kinds of programs. And yeah, so the Chisholm scenario plays out as well in this representation. And now it's a more realistic representation where we basically give the agent the chance to do the necessary preparation before actually going to help. Yeah, and so compilation works as well. And
should come to an end, Jens, I guess.
I'm coming to an end. So to conclude, we've basically proposed this kind of new situation calculus with GoLog based on a linear time semantics, which subsumes these two earlier approaches from the literature. And we also proposed a new one with a simple notion of intention. And yeah, in the future, we, among other things, want to look at more sophisticated notion of intentions and also study the interplay with belief. Yeah, so thank you for the attention.